Hello everyone, I'm Chris, and this is everything you need to know before watching Deadpool and Wolverine, releasing July 26th. If you end up enjoying this video and want to see more from us, then make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. When the Marvel Cinematic Universe first dipped their toes into a multiversal story back in 2019, fans began to speculate what this could possibly mean for the future of the franchise, and more specifically, if it could bring forth the returns of a few classic live-action Marvel character iterations, the prospect of which it's now clear in 2024 Marvel Studios had also had in mind, as on July 26th, the franchise will be shifting off course momentarily so we can meet back up with two characters originally completely separate from the main MCU, Deadpool and Wolverine. This variant of Deadpool that'll be appearing in the new film was actually first introduced to us in two films released in 2016 and 2018 respectively, produced by 20th Century Fox, who just 1 year later would end up being acquired by the Walt Disney Company, who've also owned Marvel Studios since 2009, in case you didn't already know. Since the Fox Marvel films and the main MCU had been presented as two separate entities for a whole decade though, the franchise has to take some time to build what's since been labeled the Multiverse Saga, featuring various projects focusing on universes outside of the main MCU, to seemingly allow the studio to finally bring us Deadpool 3, as well as the return of arguably the most popular Marvel character iteration, Hugh Jackman's Wolverine. Hugh Jackman first appeared as the character nearly 25 years ago in 2000's X-Men, before appearing in another 8 films within the same, somewhat confusing universe. Although it doesn't seem that this Wolverine we've come to know is the exact variant we'll be seeing in the new film, as he appears to instead just be a similar but different version of the character. Still, we'll be going over both Wolverine and Deadpool's film journeys up to this point, in addition to another important aspect of the film, the Time Variance Authority, previously seen in the MCU's Loki series. To begin, we have to go back to around 2014 and during Wade Wilson's time working as a mercenary for hire through a dodgy bar in New York City called Sister Margaret, where his best friend Weasel works as a bartender. As at said bar, he ends up one day meeting a prostitute named Vanessa, with whom he forms a near instant connection as the two immediately attempt to one-up each other with traumatizing and abusive stories of their upbringings, which leads Wade to pay for 48 minutes of her time so he can take her out to the arcade. And this, on top of the 3 minutes of sex they have afterwards, sparks the beginning of a romantic relationship between them. We watch as the couple spends the next year together, before Wade eventually decides to propose, and Vanessa says yes. But just when it appears their life is reaching its peak, Wade suddenly collapses to the floor, and his subsequent doctor's visit reveals he has late-stage cancer. Upon learning the unfortunate news, Wade prepares to exit Vanessa's life as to avoid prolonging the inevitable, but she refuses to just let him leave, and insists she'd be happier fighting alongside him until the end. So he stays, even as his health continues to deteriorate, until one day, he's met at a bar by a strange man in a black suit, who reveals he's aware of Wade's cancer diagnosis, as well as his history as a member of the Canadian Special Forces, which is why he's come to give Wade an offer, explaining he represents an organization of people that could not only cure his cancer, but also give him incredible abilities, like that of a superhero, which Wade doesn't care much for initially, but he ultimately chooses to accept the offer since it's his only real chance to have a future with Vanessa. So he leaves home and is taken to the organization's workshop, where it becomes clear rather quickly that he may have made the wrong decision, as the workshop's manager, Ajax, reveals that this is a non-government-led program, seeking to turn people like Wade into men of extraordinary abilities using a serum to potentially activate a mutant gene lurking in his DNA. Although, for this to work, they'll also need to subject him to a number of torturous experiments, since adrenaline acts as a catalyst for the serum, until either the mutant gene manifests or he eventually dies. We also learn that Ajax himself, along with others now working for the organization, like the inhumanly strong Angel Dust, who also has a weird fixation with chewing matches, were previously patients here as well, and had suffered the same treatment they're now putting Wade through, which Ajax came out of with enhanced reflexes and strength, as well as an inability to feel any pain or emotion. Despite going through countless hours of torture though, Wade still manages to consistently get under Ajax's skin, with his constant jokes and disrespect, none of which annoys him more than when Wade manages to uncover Ajax's legal name, Francis, by stealing the dry cleaning tag off his lab coat. So, having had enough of Wade's antics, Francis decides to bring his round-the-clock torture to another level, locking Wade in a machine to deprive his body of oxygen. claiming that if this doesn't unlock his mutation, nothing will. Francis also takes this opportunity to reveal the truth behind their experiments, explaining that it was never about making superheroes, but super slaves to sell to the highest bidder, before then leaving Wade trapped in the machine for the entire weekend, which does work in unlocking his mutation, enabling his body to heal itself from anything, although it also leaves his skin scarred and bubbly, a side effect Francis claims he could cure, but won't. He then has Angel prepare Wade to be locked in the box again, just because he wants him to be, prompting Wade to headbutt Angel before being once again shut in. As he'd headbutt her though, Wade also managed to knock the match out of her mouth and covertly catch it in his, so once the two leave the room, he strikes the match and tosses it near the oxygen vent, generating a massive explosion that destroys the machine in the laboratory, allowing him to escape and finally get his hands on Francis. Francis, though, soon manages to gain control in their brawl, and ultimately impales Wade with a metal bar, which leaves him trapped as the facility collapses from the explosion. But thanks to his recent mutation, he's actually able to survive all of this. Despite now being free once again, he decides against returning to his life with Vanessa, afraid of what she may think of his new appearance, and he instead returns to Sister Margaret's to reunite with Weasel, with whom he discusses his plans of hunting down Francis so he can fix his face. For this, Wade decides to take on the moniker of Deadpool, and creates a suit to keep his real identity hidden. And as Deadpool, he spends the next year tracking down and killing anyone connected to Francis, including the recruiter from earlier, until he's finally given his location, which he makes his way to via taxi, driven by a man named Dopinder, who Wade bonds with briefly before being dropped off on the bridge so he can dive straight down into a vehicle of Francis's henchmen, each of whom he almost effortlessly manages to take out ahead of the arrival of Francis himself, who he also manages to easily take down before stabbing him through the shoulder and pinning him to the bridge with his katana. Just then though, Wade's suddenly interrupted by the arrival of Colossus, a member of the X-Men's team of mutant superheroes who's been trying for quite some time now to convince Deadpool to use his powers for good and fight alongside them. But Wade's consistently refused, preferring his form of justice over theirs. Still, Colossus can't just stand by and let Wade kill Francis, so he'll be taking them both back with him and his trainee Negasonic Teenage Warhead to the X-Mansion. Although, before they can apprehend Francis, they realize he'd already managed to escape on his motorcycle, infuriating Wade and prompting him to attack Colossus, which just results in him breaking both his hands and one of his legs. Colossus then handcuffs himself to the injured Deadpool, but it isn't long before the latter manages to free himself, cutting through his wrist with one of his knives before free-falling off the bridge into a truck passing by below and returning home, which he shares with a blind woman named Al he met at the laundromat to regroup. While he does that, Francis and Angel make their way over to Sister Margaret's in search of Wade's current whereabouts, and although they're unable to learn that information, they do find a photo posted behind the bar of Wade and Vanessa, causing them to instead shift their focus onto her, which Weasel immediately informs Wade of following their exit, but apparently not soon enough, as Wade's still unable to prevent them from kidnapping her. So in need of some help, he heads over to the X-Mansion and demands that Colossus and Negasonic Teenage Warhead join him in his fight, to which they agree, traveling via Dopinder's taxi alongside him over to where Francis is holding Vanessa, and upon their arrival, Wade quickly gets to slicing through his henchmen, while Colossus and Negasonic battle Angel, before soon enough, Deadpool's engaging in a battle with Francis once again, but this time, it ends with Wade coming out on top, and with Francis now at his mercy, Wade demands he fix what he'd done to him. Unfortunately for Wade though, Francis reveals that there isn't actually any way to reverse what's been done, and mocks him for believing that to be the case. But this now leaves Wade with no use for him, so despite Colossus trying his best to persuade him against it, Wade promptly shoots Francis in the face. He's then confronted by confused and furious Vanessa, to whom he apologizes for all he's put her through, and finally reveals what had happened to him, which although acknowledging she'll need some adjusting, doesn't change anything about how she feels about him, and so the two are able to return to their lives together. Since Wade's able to return to his normal life, he also decides to go back to being a mercenary for hire, now using his mutant abilities to take jobs all across the globe, with his world tour spanning across Hong Kong, Sicily, Tokyo, and Biloxi over the next 2 years, before making it all the way back to New York, where he's been hired to kill a drug lord named Sergei Velishnikov and his dealers. He's unable to complete his mission on his first attempt though, after being overwhelmingly outnumbered, so he instead runs out of the building and into Dopinder's taxi to be brought home. since he's already late for his and Vanessa's anniversary celebration anyway. Upon returning home, the couple exchange their anniversary gifts, with Wade gifting her a skee ball token from their first date, and Vanessa gifting him her birth control device, revealing she's ready to have his baby, which immediately leads to them having sex. After sex though, as they're watching a movie and thinking up baby names, Wade overhears something from outside their apartment, soon revealed to be a group of armed men, each of whom he manages to swiftly kill outside of one man still outside, Sergei Velishnikov, who suddenly fires and shoots Vanessa in the chest, killing her instantly, which prompts an enraged Wade to chase Sergei down into the street, wrap his arms around him, and throws them both into oncoming traffic to kill him. Following Vanessa's sudden and shocking death, Wade, after days and days of mourning, decides in an attempt to reunite with her to try and end his own life by blowing himself up in his apartment. This only works for a brief moment, during which he enters what appears to be the afterlife, standing beside Vanessa within his apartment, although unable to reach her due to an invisible barrier keeping them apart, as she explains that his heart's not in the right place, before his consciousness is then suddenly sent flying back into his dismembered body that ends up being found and pieced back together by Colossus. After bringing Wade back to the X-Mansion, where we're also introduced to Negasonic's girlfriend Yukio, Colossus attempts to once again convince Wade to join the X-Men, believing it'll allow him a fresh start, and claiming that although they aren't the family he wants, they may be the family he needs. And Wade, although still believing he isn't X-Men material, agrees to sign on as an X-Men trainee. To begin his training, Colossus has Wade join him and Negasonic on their mission to apprehend a mutant boy named Russell, who prefers the name Fire Fist, and who's unleashed an attack against the Essex house for mutant rehabilitation in what's apparently his 5th incident. In the trio's confrontation with the boy, Wade attempts to take control of the situation and talk Russell down, but he only ends up annoying him, resulting in them each being sent flying with a blast, before Wade then knocks him out by launching the bottom end of his katana at his head, enabling the nearby authorities to lock a power dampening collar around the boy's neck to negate his abilities. It soon becomes clear that Russell actually had some valid reasoning behind his attack though, as after Russell begs to not be sent back to the Essex house, Wade notices some scars on his neck that Russell reveals were caused by the orphanage's employees. So Wade, refusing to let them get off easy for torturing a young boy, suddenly shoots one of them in the head. But before he can kill the others, he's speared to the ground by Colossus, who, for going against their rules and letting him down once again, has a power dampening collar locked on Wade so he and Russell can be sent to the icebox, a prison designed to contain dangerous mutants. Since the collar rids Wade of his mutant abilities, his body's once again unable to fight his cancer, but Russell claims to protect him and soon break them both out of here, so he can begin his quest for revenge against the Essex House's headmaster, who Russell reveals actually hates mutants. Wade, though, insists they're not friends and believes they should both just focus on themselves, since he doesn't have much time left anyway. It appears Wade's death may come even sooner than he'd expected just a few days into their imprisonment though, when the building's suddenly attacked by a man with high-tech weaponry and a robotic arm, later revealed to be named Cable, who immediately turns his attention to and fires his weapon at Wade and Russell's cell, who'd luckily already managed to escape it. So Cable continues chasing them down before finally intercepting them, upon which it's revealed that he's not actually after Wade, but Russell, as he aims his gun at the boy. But the shot's fortunately thwarted by Wade, prompting Cable to then drive his robotic arm through Wade's chest before aiming his gun at his head. But this shot is also thwarted, as Wade manages to instead point it down towards his collar to destroy it. With his powers restored, Wade engages in a back and forth brawl with Cable, although eventually, Cable fully regains the upper hand, even knocking Vanessa's skee-ball token that Wade kept with him since her passing out of his possession and picking it up as something to remember him by, before questioning why Wade insists on protecting the boy. And Wade, after noticing Russell listening nearby, claims he doesn't care about him as a way of getting him out of harm's way, which works, allowing Wade to then pull the pin on one of Cable's grenades, creating a huge explosion that sends them both flying out of the building, and ends up sending Wade back into the afterlife once again, where he's still unable to reach Vanessa. He's left questioning what her words from earlier could have meant, and if maybe it had something to do with Russell, and she responds with something she told him moments before her death.
Kids give us a chance to be better than we used to be.
Upon regaining consciousness, Wade heads back to New York and to Sister Margaret's to fill Weasel as well as Dopinder, who now also works as the bar's janitor, in on what he'd seen and his plans to help Russell. Through Weasel's connections, he's able to learn that the Icebox's prisoners are actually about to be transferred to a Supermax prison 80 miles away. So to break Russell out and prevent Cable from killing him, Wade proposes they put together a team, the X-Force. Russell, though, has already begun forming his own plan of escape, involving the huge monster locked in the Icebox's basement, who Russell's quickly able to make friends with by offering him his lunch. After a round of X-Force tryouts, Deadpool ultimately recruits 6 members, including Bedlam, who has the ability to distort electrical fields, Zeitgeist, who spits acidic vomit, the Vanisher, who has the ability to become completely invisible, Shatterstar, an alien from the planet Mojo World, Domino, an orphan who'd grown up in the Essex house and is apparently just abnormally lucky, and Peter, who has no superpowers but thought the ad looked fun. And together, they all fly over to Russell's armored convoy. Unfortunately though, as they're diving down with their parachutes, they each end up dying one by one due to the higher winds, with Bedlam heading straight into a bus, Shatterstar heading straight into a nearby helicopter, the Vanisher heading straight into electrical wires and cables, Zeitgeist heading straight into a wood chipper, and Peter getting killed by Zeitgeist's acidic vomit while trying to help him out. But luckily for Domino, she manages to be the only one to land perfectly fine on top of the convoy, before taking out each officer inside and its driver. Deadpool also soon makes it to the convoy, as well as Cable, with whom he engages in another back and forth brawl before the sudden emergence of Russell and the Icebox's monster, the Juggernaut, who immediately destroys the vehicle before rushing at and tearing Deadpool in half, as he and Russell prepare to kill the headmaster. Now having to wait for his legs to grow back, Wade heads over to Blind Owl's apartment with Domino, Weasel, and Dopinder, where the 5 are then also met by Cable, who to their surprise is actually there to ask for Wade's help. Here we learn that Cable is actually a time traveler from over 50 years in the future, whose job was to track down and stop the world's most dastardly criminals, including the likes of Russell, who he explains, after killing the headmaster, gets a taste for the act of murder, leading him to kill more and more people until eventually he decides to kill Cable's wife and daughter, the latter of whom's blood-stained teddy bear Cable's been carrying around with him. So to prevent their deaths, Cable's traveled back here so that he can kill Russell before his killing streak begins. Wade, although understanding of his situation, still refuses to help him kill a kid, and instead asks Cable for a chance to put Russell on a different path, to which he reluctantly agrees. So once Wade's legs have grown back, he, Cable, and Domino head off in Dopinder's taxi to intercept Russell and the Juggernaut. Although on the way, Wade has Dopinder make a quick stop at the X-Mansion, hoping he can make amends with them and gain their help. And although initially refusing, Colossus, Negasonic, and Yukio eventually arrive at the Essex house alongside them, taking on and eventually incapacitating the Juggernaut, while Domino heads inside the building to free the orphans, and Deadpool and Cable chase after Russell, who himself has begun chasing after the headmaster. Fortunately, Wade's able to reach him just before he can commit the murder, but although doing his best to convince him against killing him, and apologizing for leaving him behind in the prison, Russell still believes he can't trust Wade, and so sends him flying with a blast, forcing the latter in a last-ditch effort to then lock a power dampening collar around his own neck, and claim that if Russell's going to kill anyone, it's going to have to be him. Before Russell can make his decision though, Cable decides he's seen enough, and so he dives for his gun and fires it at the boy. But his death is ultimately prevented at the last second by Wade, diving in front of him and taking the bullet for him. Wade's willingness to sacrifice his own life for Russell's proves to be enough to end the boy's quest for revenge, as seen by the blood burnt on Cable's daughter's teddy bear fading away. So Wade, having set Russell on a new path, decides against removing the collar from around his neck, believing he's now ready to reunite with Vanessa. And so, after saying his goodbyes to his found family, he breathes his final breath and returns to the afterlife, now with no barrier keeping him and Vanessa apart. But even after all this, Vanessa reveals that it's still not yet their time, claiming his family still needs him. And Wade, although saddened that Vanessa won't be there with him when he goes back, is more than willing to wait for her. So the two share I love yous and a goodbye kiss before he returns back to his body once again, which it turns out is actually thanks to Cable, who decided shortly following Wade's passing to travel back in time to the moment they'd arrived at the building so he could place Wade's skee-ball token within his suit for it to block the bullet and prevent his death. With the day saved and them all having made it out alive, the group begins making their way back home, although as they do, they're interrupted by the headmaster, whose life is ultimately taken away when he's then suddenly run over and killed by Dopinder. Sometime following all this, back in the X-Mansion, Wade somehow manages to get hold of Cable's time travel device and immediately begins using it to irresponsibly jump through time, with him first traveling back to prevent Vanessa's death before subsequently traveling back to prevent Peter's, and then traveling back to what appears to be another timeline so that he can kill an alternate version of himself ahead of his confrontation with the Wolverine, who Wade warns that one day he's gonna ask him to get back in the saddle and implores him to say yes when he does. To begin, we have to head all the way back to 1845 into Northwest Territories, Canada, where we meet a couple young boys named James Howlett and Victor Creed, the former of whom is sick. We also soon meet Jimmy's father John as he enters his son's room to check on him, although he's quickly interrupted by some banging and shouting at the door from Victor's drunken father, Thomas Logan, calling for Jimmy's mother, Elizabeth. So John and Victor head downstairs, followed by a sudden gunshot that prompts Jimmy to run down as well, where he finds that Thomas has killed his father. This traumatic event subsequently triggers a mutation for the boy. His bone claws begin to sprout from his fists, before Jimmy, unable to control his anger, then rushes at and kills his father's murderer. Although, as he dies, Thomas reveals that he is his real father, not John. As it turns out, Jimmy was born out of an affair between Elizabeth and Victor's father. Jimmy's mother is horrified by her son's mutation, questioning what he even is, which prompts him to flee into the woods, followed by Victor, who we later learn is also a mutant, and who proclaims that, as brothers, they must stick together and protect one another, seeing as they have no one else left who will accept them for who they are. As the two grow older, James, now going by Logan after his biological father, and Victor decide to put their abilities and overwhelming rage to good use, fighting for the US in multiple notable wars, such as the American Civil War and World War I, during each of which one of them takes a fatal shot, but their regenerative healing factors allow them to survive, as well as basically not age over the course of their lives. As they enter World War II though, Victor's motivations begin to appear much darker, as during the D-Day invasion, he's noticeably more uncontrolled and violent, much to Logan's concern. Although it's unclear whether this plays a part in the latter later transferring from the European front to the Pacific front the following year, where he's unfortunately soon captured by Japanese forces and sent to a POW camp near Nagasaki, in which he's held within a chained-up well all the way until the Nagasaki bombing of August 9th, 1945. Ahead of which he sees a young officer of the Imperial Japanese Army named Ichiro Yoshida helping evacuate the city, including the prisoners held within it, before the soldier rushes to the well to help get Logan out as well, but he refuses and instead just advises Yoshida to leave. It appears it may be too late for him though, as the bomb is suddenly dropped, leaving him frozen in a state of shock until Logan rushes over to grab and bring him down into the well that they're unable to cover before the explosion reaches them. So Logan just covers Yoshida with the well's lid and takes the entirety of the impact onto himself, which Yoshida then watches his body heal from immediately after. Moving on to yet another war, this time the Vietnam War, as Logan and Victor are once again battling alongside one another. Although soon, Victor's violent tendencies become even more prevalent when he attacks, captures, and attempts to rape a young Vietnamese village woman, forcing his platoon to interfere, which prompts Victor to unleash an attack against them, as well as kill a senior officer. Logan, although uneased by Victor's actions, still decides to defend and stand alongside his brother, resulting in them both being sentenced to death. But the two's healing factors make it impossible for the firing squad to carry out their sentences, so they're instead locked up in a cell, later to be met by Major William Stryker, who's revealed to have a keen interest in their mutant abilities. As we later learn, he's actually been researching mutants for quite a while, since his son Jason is also a mutant with telepathic abilities. Jason found it difficult to deal with his powers though, and all the voices inside his head, resulting in him resenting his parents and blaming them for his condition. So to get back at them, he began projecting visions and scenarios into their brains, which tragically eventually led his mother to take her own life, in turn prompting Stryker to cryogenically freeze and imprison his son. Since then, Stryker's spent years solely focusing on mutants, and has now begun building a Black Ops team of mutants called Team X, which he convinces Logan and Victor to join in exchange for freeing them from their imprisonment. We then move ahead to the team's mission in Lagos, Nigeria, where they've been sent to retrieve a mysterious meteorite from a diamond trafficking operation. And there, we're introduced to each of Team X's members, including Fred Dukes, Chris Bradley, David Nord aka Agent Zero, John Rath, and Wade Wilson, a skilled assassin who, like Logan and Victor, possesses a regenerative healing factor. Using their combined skills, the team breaks their way into the compound and takes down its security en route to confronting its leader, from whom Stryker collects the meteorite and learns of the remote village where they'd found it, to which they travel next, and there, Stryker promptly begins interrogating its people. But they refuse to reveal anything, so instead, Stryker orders the team to begin killing the villagers. However, their attack is soon interrupted by Logan, claiming killing innocent people isn't what he signed up for, and he ultimately quits the team, although without his brother, as Victor chooses to stay. At some point over the next 6 years following his departure, Logan moves to the Canadian Rockies, where he lives and is in a romantic relationship with school teacher Kayla Silverfox, who's aware but not afraid of his mutant abilities. Logan also now works as a lumberjack, although his work is suddenly interrupted one day by the arrival of Stryker and Zero, who've come to ask for his help, as recently, both Wade Wilson and Chris Bradley were reportedly killed by an unknown assailant, who they believe is looking to track down the rest of Team X as well. But Logan refuses to offer them any assistance, claiming he can take care of himself. Unfortunately, it seems Logan's next on this unknown killer's list of victims, as while at work, he begins to sense the presence of his brother, who he hasn't seen since his departure from the team. And after following the scent, he soon comes across Kayla's car abandoned in a ditch as well as her body, and it appears she's been killed by Victor. So Logan tracks his brother down at a bar, and the two promptly engage in a huge brawl, which Victor ultimately comes out on top of after launching Logan into oncoming traffic and stomping off the bone claws on his left hand before exiting. The following day, Logan's once again met by Stryker in hopes that he'd now be more willing to form an alliance, as Stryker believes he may be able to give Logan the tools to stop and defeat his brother using the meteorite he'd been searching for 6 years ago, and Logan, determined to kill Victor for what he's done, agrees. So Logan's later taken to an abandoned military compound in the Canadian Rockies and prepared for the Weapon X operation to bond his skeleton with adamantium, a metal compound created from the meteorite capable of withstanding virtually anything. This process, though, proves to be incredibly painful and life-threatening, with it actually causing Logan to momentarily flatline. But thanks to his healing factor, he returns to life with the adamantium bonding complete. But as he's incapacitated, Stryker makes his true motivations clear, as he and Zero discuss bringing Logan to the island before ordering to have Logan's memory erased so they could use his DNA for the Weapon 11. Fortunately though, this conversation's overheard by Logan, who comes bursting out of his pod and fights off every guard in his path before ultimately breaking out of the building and escaping down a waterfall. But he's not able to remain out of their sights for long, as he's soon tracked down and attacked by a unit of Stryker's men led by Zero, who ultimately fail in taking him down, as he instead manages to take out each vehicle pursuing him, along with Zero's chopper, who's killed in a huge explosion. To try and understand more of what happened with Team X over the last 6 years and what Stryker's true plans are, Logan heads to Las Vegas to reunite with John Rath, and he reveals that, after Logan's exit, Stryker began sending the team on missions to hunt down other mutants, claiming they'd be making a difference by protecting people from the bad ones. John doesn't know much about this island Stryker and Zero had been talking about though, but believes Fred Dukes might, so he takes Logan to see him, and Fred reveals that the island is where Stryker takes and experiments on mutants after Victor's captured them, seeking to combine their powers and create the perfect soldier. Furious upon learning Stryker's been working with Victor this entire time, Logan demands to know the island's location, so Fred directs him to one of Stryker's escaped prisoners, Remy LeBeau, aka Gambit, who along with John, Logan soon finds at the casino, although Remy initially believes he's working for Stryker and so attacks him. But Logan ultimately manages to come out on top of the battle, and eventually convinces Remy to take him to the island. As they were fighting though, John was also attacked and unfortunately quickly killed by Victor, who had also killed Fred just moments after John and Logan had left the gym. Upon arriving at the island, revealed to be the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, Logan sneaks his way into the facility and is quickly spotted by Stryker, who finally reveals the truth, explaining he's always planned on using him for his powers, but since he abandoned him and the team, he was forced to form a new strategy using Kayla, who's revealed to still be alive and to have been working with Stryker all this time as well, as she's also a mutant, with the ability to influence people upon touching them. Heartbroken and shocked, Logan decides to cut his losses and exits, and with Logan seemingly dealt with, Kayla then asks that Stryker make good on his end of the deal and frees her sister, another mutant named Emma, but he still wants to run some more tests and refuses, prompting her, now realizing she's being used, to try and make a run for it. but he's stopped in her tracks by Victor, who begins strangling her to death, until Logan suddenly returns and attacks him. Despite wanting to kill his brother though, he chooses to restrain himself for now and just knocks him out, before being met again by Kayla, who begs for his help in freeing her sister, and he agrees, freeing her along with all of Stryker's other imprisoned mutants. Their escape from the facility is immediately interrupted though by Stryker's Weapon 11, revealed to be a still alive Wade Wilson who's now been transformed into Deadpool, forcing Kayla and the mutants to look for a different way out while Logan battles against him. Their battle quickly travels all the way up one of the nuclear reactor's cooling towers, atop of which Deadpool nearly decapitates Logan, but he's fortunately thwarted by Victor, refusing to let anyone but himself kill Logan. So the two brothers fight side by side once again, eventually allowing Logan the opportunity to decapitate Deadpool with his adamantium claws, although his eyes continue firing energy blasts out as his head falls down the tower, resulting in it crumbling to the ground, and in turn for Logan to lose sight of his brother. Logan's then reunited with Kayla, who despite having been shot while leading the mutants out of the facility, dragged herself back to Logan to tell him she loves him, leading the two to share a kiss as he prepares to carry her off the island. Although that's then interrupted when he's suddenly shot with adamantium bullets by Stryker, prompting Logan to furiously rush towards him, which inadvertently gives Stryker a clean shot directly at his head, knocking him out. After firing one shot into Logan's skull, Stryker prepares to kill Kayla as well, but she's able to grab hold of his leg and influence him into throwing the gun away and walking out of here until his feet bleed, before she finally passes away from her wound, while Logan then awakens in a confused state, with no memory of what just took place or who he even is, outside of his dog tag reading the names Logan and Wolverine. For the next 20 plus years, Logan's left wandering the earth in search of who and what he really is. But he's yet to find the answers he's looking for by the early 2000s, and instead finds himself fighting in caged bar fights for money. One day though, while on the road, he notices that someone's hitched a ride in the back of his truck, with that someone being a young girl named Marie, who now also chooses to go by Rogue, and is another mutant who, after the traumatic manifestation of her powers, which caused her to absorb the life force of whomever she touches, and that saw her put her boyfriend into a coma, decided to run away from home, eventually bringing her all the way here. So, after discovering another mutant in Logan after seeing him fight, she was hoping he'd let her hitchhike with him, and Logan, although initially refusing, ultimately lets her. Their ride is soon interrupted though, when a tree is suddenly thrown into their path, causing Logan to crash before then being attacked by Sabretooth, who we learn is actually Logan's brother Victor, now even more animalistic than before, and with seemingly no memory of their shared history, although it's unclear how he came to be this way. This version of Sabretooth proves to be quite the challenge for Logan, as the latter's eventually knocked out and nearly killed, but he and Rogue are ultimately saved by the arrival of two X-Men, Scott Summers, also known as Cyclops, who has the ability to fire optic energy blasts from his eyes, and Aurora Monroe, aka Storm, who has the ability to control weather. And their combined powers force Victor to flee. Rogue and an incapacitated Logan are then transported all the way to Westchester, New York, and to Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, where an immensely powerful mutant with telepathic abilities named Charles Xavier, also known as Professor X, helps educate young mutants while also giving them a sense of belonging. And Logan, after receiving medical attention from Dr. Jean Grey, another mutant with telepathic and telekinetic powers, who he immediately becomes romantically fixated on, despite her being Scott's girlfriend, is brought before the professor, who explains that the mutant who'd attacked him earlier was sent by another very powerful mutant with the ability to control metallic objects named Magneto, real name Eric Lensher, who used to be a close friend of Xavier's until the two's different views on the prospect of their kind and ordinary humans coexisting forced them to go their separate ways. And now Eric believes there's a war brewing between mutants and the rest of humanity. So Charles asks that Logan stay here for the next 48 hours until they can find out what Magneto wants with him. And Logan agrees in exchange for Xavier's help in piecing together his forgotten past. It isn't until that second day at the X Mansion that they actually uncover what Magneto's plans are though, which comes as a result of Rogue, after still struggling to fit in even at a school full of kids like her, attempting to go on the run once again, leading Logan to leave as well so he can track her down, with him eventually finding her at a train station, where after convincing her to return to the school, believing Xavier really does want the best for her, they're met by Magneto, who, after using Logan's metallic skeleton against him to render him completely useless, shifts his attention onto Rogue, revealing she's the one he's really been after before abducting and exiting with her. We also see that while the X-Men are occupied with the situation, one of Magneto's most loyal followers, Mystique, a mutant with the ability to shapeshift into anything she sees and who was actually a childhood friend of Charles before Eric put her on a darker path, manages to sneak her way down to the mansion's sub-basement and gain access to Cerebro, a device Charles uses to amplify his telepathic power so he can reach mutants across the world, and which she tampers with before reuniting with Magneto and the rest of his Brotherhood of Mutants. Following Logan's return to the mansion, Charles is able to discover why Eric's captured Rogue, revealing that he's created a mutant conversion machine which emits radiation that triggers mutation in ordinary humans. But in order for it to work, Eric must use his abilities to power it himself, which greatly weakens him. So he's now planning to briefly transfer his powers to Rogue so she can be sacrificed to power the machine instead. Using Cerebro, they're able to find where Magneto's taken Rogue at Liberty Island. So Cyclops, Storm, Jean, and Wolverine make their trip over and immediately enter a battle against members of Magneto's Brotherhood of Mutants, including Sabretooth, a mutant called Toad, and Mystique, each of whom are eventually taken out by the X-Men's collective efforts, before the heroes ultimately manage to thwart Eric's plans, guiding Logan up to the machine so that he, following a blast from Cyclops that incapacitates Magneto, can destroy it. Unfortunately though, it appears the damage has already been done, with Rogue unlikely to survive. So in an attempt to save her, Logan allows her to absorb his healing abilities, and this works in bringing her back to life, but leaves him severely injured and in a coma that he fortunately later wakes up from. With Eric now locked away in a plastic prison, Charles looks to make good on his promise from earlier and directs Logan to an abandoned military compound at Alkali Lake in the Canadian Rockies. Although when he eventually gets there, there's nothing left of it to be found. So Logan returns to the school and reunites with the rest of the X-Men, who are a bit preoccupied at the moment after learning of a mutant with teleportation abilities named Kurt Wagner, aka the Nightcrawler, having recently unleashed an attack against and nearly killed the president. Unsure of who else could have been behind the attack, Charles decides to visit Eric in his plastic prison, but to his shock, he arrives to find Eric in a much worse state than he'd previously left him in, as it's revealed that lately he's been having frequent visits from one William Stryker, the man actually behind Kurt's attack, and who since his failed attempts to build the perfect mutant soldier years ago, had begun looking for a way to fix the world's mutant problem altogether, which he believes he may now be able to do thanks to Eric's imprisonment, as it's allowed him access to information he wouldn't have been able to uncover otherwise, such as the location of Xavier's school and Cerebro, which he's forced Eric to reveal using a serum that he'd also used on Nightcrawler, derived from his now lobotomized son Jason's brain. Immediately following this revelation, Eric and Charles are suddenly incapacitated by some sort of gas slowly being pumped into his cell, allowing the latter to be abducted by another of Stryker's mind-controlled mutants, Yuriko Oyama, aka Lady Deathstrike. With Charles captured, Stryker then turns his focus onto the X-Mansion, unleashing an attack against it that night in an attempt to kidnap some of their students. But thanks to the combined efforts of Logan, Rogue, and a few of Xavier's other older students, including Peter Rasputin, aka Colossus, Bobby Drake, aka Iceman, and John Allardyce, aka Pyro, most of the kids are able to make it out safely. Although, just before Logan can join them in their exit, he hears the familiar voice of Stryker, leaving him almost frozen in place until he's rushed out of the building by the older kids. Logan then meets back up with Jean and Storm shortly thereafter, before the three's flight is suddenly interrupted by Magneto, who'd managed to escape his plastic prison not too long after Xavier was abducted thanks to help from Mystique, and has now tracked down the X-Men in hopes that they could form some sort of alliance. He reveals that Stryker plans on using his son's powers against Charles to manipulate him into killing every mutant on Earth, with the use of his base's own Cerebro. And so, although reluctant to work together with their recent foes, the team ultimately agrees to become temporary allies. So, after Jean uses her abilities to uncover the location of Stryker's base, revealed to be underground at Alkali Lake, the team prepares a plan of attack. Although before beginning their journey to the base, Logan pulls Jean aside for a moment, unable to fend off his feelings for her. And despite Jean claiming she loves Scott, Logan still decides to plant a kiss on her anyway, leaving her conflicted and prompting her to storm off. Once at the base, the team quickly manages to take out every guard in their path before being forced to split up, with Jean staying behind after being attacked by a mind-controlled Cyclops, who she eventually manages to free from Stryker's control by reversing one of his blasts back onto him, which also inadvertently ends up damaging the dam, while Magneto and Mystique head towards Cerebro, and Wolverine goes off in search of Stryker, eventually leading him to the room where his Weapon X procedure had originally taken place, which causes his memories of that day to finally return to the surface, before he's then met by Stryker and subsequently attacked by Lady Deathstrike, revealed to have also gone through a similar procedure, with adamantium claws of her own. But ultimately, after a violent and mostly balanced fight, Logan's able to just narrowly come out on top by injecting her with some of Stryker's raw adamantium, presumably killing her. Magneto, meanwhile, arrives at and promptly tears open the door to Cerebro, halting Jason's attempts at killing all the world's mutants, and soon joining them is Mystique disguised as William Stryker, who gives Jason a new mission to instead find and kill every human on Earth, before the two then exit and fly off the base, although just before leaving, Eric also finds and chains up Stryker, leaving him for dead. Eric's plan is soon discovered and also thwarted though by the X-Men, after Storm uses her powers to freeze Jason until he gives up control over Charles, preventing him from killing anyone. The heroes then promptly rush out of the base as the dam's begun to collapse. However, it doesn't appear they'll be able to escape the impending flood anyway, as their jet refuses to start. But their lives are ultimately saved by Jean, who slips out of the ship amid the chaos and locks it behind her, before using her powers to lift it up into the sky while simultaneously holding off the flood until they're high enough to take off. And once they are, she allows herself to be engulfed by the flood, leaving both Scott and Logan heartbroken. Over the next few years, the heroes are seen still struggling to come to terms with Jean's death, as is specifically the case for Scott, who appears to be worse than ever, as he's begun hearing Jean's voice calling out for him, which prompts him to make the trip back to Alkali Lake. There, the sound of her voice grows even louder, but he just believes it's his mind playing tricks on him. That is until shockingly, Jean suddenly emerges from the ocean, somehow still alive, allowing the two to share a long-awaited embrace and a kiss, although as they're kissing, something strange begins happening to Scott, drawing Professor X's attention from all the way at the X Mansion. So Charles orders Logan and Storm to head over to Alkali Lake and find him, but the only person they end up finding is an unconscious Jean. While examining her, Charles reveals some previously hidden information about her to Logan that he now must know, explaining that Jean is the only Class 5 mutant he's ever encountered, meaning her potential is practically limitless, but her mutation happens to be seated in the unconscious part of her mind, making her potential incredibly dangerous. So Charles, when she was just a young girl, created a series of psychic barriers to isolate her powers from her conscious mind, allowing them to remain under control. Although this also resulted in her developing a dual personality that in their sessions came to call itself the Phoenix, which he worries may come to the surface if he doesn't restore the psychic blocks he'd previously set. And Charles is soon proven justified for trying to keep the Phoenix under control, as after Jean eventually awakens, she suddenly attacks Logan as she makes her way out of the school. Coinciding with all of this going on with Jean is the recent development of what's been dubbed the mutant cure, created by major pharmaceutical company Worthington Labs, which has left mutants like Magneto enraged by what they consider to be an attempt at exterminating them all. So Magneto's begun rapidly recruiting other mutants to his brotherhood in preparation for his much anticipated war against humans, including the likes of the aforementioned Pyro, Callisto, Quill, Arclight, James Madrox aka Multiple Man, and the Juggernaut, Kane Markup. And upon learning of Jean's re-emergence, with even greater power than before, Magneto hopes to recruit her for his cause as well. Also greatly disturbed and disappointed with this mutant cure is the current Secretary of Mutant Affairs, Hank McCoy, aka Beast, a longtime friend of Professor X, who upon learning the government is planning on weaponizing the cure, decides to resign from his position so that he could be where he belongs as Magneto's war approaches and reunite with the X-Men, who are still wrapped up in whatever's going on with Jean. Although Charles is eventually able to pinpoint her location, tracking her down at her old family home, just as Eric manages to do the same. So the two enter the house together, with Eric urging her to accept her newfound power, while Charles tries his best to bring the real Jean back, and unfortunately, she ultimately chooses the former, although not in the way Eric had expected or hoped for, as she shockingly uses her immense power to seemingly kill Charles, before exiting the house with a shooken up Magneto. As the X-Men and their students mourn the loss of their beloved professor, Magneto continues pushing forward with his mission, next preparing to abduct the source of the mutant cure, a young mutant boy named Jimmy, also called Leech, who has the ability to nullify the powers of other mutants when they come near him. The X-Men, though, soon become aware of these plans, and so, despite being significantly outnumbered, head off to hopefully prevent this war from going any further, with them eventually arriving in the midst of a battle between Magneto's Brotherhood and US soldiers armed with cure weapons. And eventually they manage to, after finding a few cure darts scattered on the battlefield. That Beast, thanks to a distraction from Wolverine, then drives into Magneto's chest, ridding him of his mutant abilities. With Eric finally defeated, Logan approaches Jean, hoping he may still be able to get her back on their side of the fight, but she instead unleashes another telekinetic storm that continues growing and growing, forcing everyone on both sides to make a run for it, as well as turning many of them into dust. Logan, though, manages to fight through the storm and make it face to face with Jean, who furiously questions why he'd risk dying for these people.
No, not for them, for you.
These few words prove to be enough to finally bring Jean's true self back to the surface for a brief moment, with her begging Logan to save her. And so, after telling her he loves her, he pulls out his claws and fatally stabs her through the abdomen, bringing an end to the Phoenix's destruction. In the 7 years after being forced to kill the woman he loved, Logan's begun living as a hermit in the Canadian wilderness. That is until the one day he's met by a woman named Yukio, revealed to also be a mutant with a haunting ability, as she's able to foresee the deaths of others. The reason she's tracked him down, though, isn't because of his own death, but the death of a man he'd saved the life of years ago, Ichiro Yoshida, now one of the most powerful business leaders in Japan. As with Yoshida's health rapidly deteriorating as he's grown older, he's asked that Logan meet with him in person so he could say goodbye. Upon reuniting with Logan for the first time in almost 70 years, though, Yoshida reveals that he hadn't actually sent for him just to say goodbye, but also to repay him, claiming that his technology company, the Yoshida Corporation, could possibly rid him of the curse he's been forced to carry for over a century and a half, the inability to die, and pass it on to himself. But Logan, although yearning to escape this life and the haunting memories of his past, refuses Yoshida's offer, believing he's better off without the burden. And that night, as Logan sleeps, he's met by Yukio, who informs him that Yoshida has died, much to her own confusion, as she hadn't foreseen it. And things become even more strange during Yoshida's subsequent funeral, when it's suddenly attacked by disguised members of the Yakuza. Still, Logan's able to take out nearly all of the ceremony's attackers, with help from an unknown man firing arrows from above, before they can reach their primary target, Yoshida's granddaughter Mariko, who Logan eventually escapes with to her home in Nagasaki. There, Logan gets a better understanding of why she may have been targeted, as she explains that, despite her not wanting it, her grandfather had decided to leave her control of his company in his will, much to the surprise and frustration of her father Shingen, who's seeking to kill her so he can take control of Yoshida's company. As the two remain hidden for the next couple days, they quickly begin lusting over one another, eventually leading to them having sex. Although the next morning, the Yakuza finally manage to track them down and abduct Mariko for Shingen. We then see as he now has Mariko brought before him so he can follow through with that objective himself. But before he can harm her, his home is quietly attacked by a group of ninjas known as the Black Clan, led by a childhood friend of Mariko's, Kanuchio Harada, who escorts Mariko out of the home while Shingen is met by Yoshida's oncologist, Dr. Green, revealed to also be a mutant known as Viper, with the ability to spit poisonous substances that she now uses to incapacitate Shingen before leaving a note behind reading "Come Get Her" beside an image of one of Yoshida's facilities in the north, to be found shortly thereafter by Logan. Before making the journey there with Yukio, though, Shingen re-emerges and, blaming Logan for all that's happened, he attempts to kill him. But his attack ultimately fails, as he's instead the one who's killed. Upon arriving at Yoshida's lab, Logan's unfortunately soon incapacitated by a poisoned arrow from Harada, and eventually awakens trapped in an adamantium device, locking his arms and claws in place, before Viper then introduces him to the Silver Samurai, an incredibly powerful suit of armor made completely with adamantium, in which suddenly rises to its feet and prepares to slice off Logan's claws with a heated sword. but its attack is thwarted by Mariko, who manages to escape Harada's custody and take the Silver Samurai down, in turn freeing Logan, who then enters into a battle against the giant, while Yukio finally arrives to battle and ultimately kill Viper. Logan doesn't fare quite as well in his fight though, despite gaining help from Harada after he'd realized the error of his ways, as the Silver Samurai manages to stab and kill Harada while also slicing off each of Logan's claws and drilling itself into the wounds so that it can begin transferring his life force and ability to heal to Ichiro Yoshida, revealed to still be alive thanks to the Silver Samurai suit's life-prolonging capabilities. But Yoshida's plan ultimately fails after Mariko, refusing to let her grandfather kill Logan for his own gain, launches a knife at the back of his head, allowing Logan a moment to regain his strength and pull out his bone claws to bring Yoshida's life to a definitive end. 2 years following what took place in Japan, we see as Logan enters an airport and is shockingly met by none other than Magneto, whose powers since receiving the mutant cure have returned, likely meaning that the cure was actually only temporary. Eric's not here looking for a fight as Logan had expected, however, as he's actually seeking his help, revealing that there are human forces building a weapon that could bring the end of their kind, which Logan struggles to believe, having no reason to trust Eric. That isn't until the two are joined by a somehow still alive Charles. The two explain that all the way back in 1973, a little over a decade after the existence of mutants became more widely known, the world's leading weapon designer, Bolivar Trask, with aid from Logan's familiar foe William Stryker prior to the creation of Team X, had begun capturing and experimenting on mutants, using their gifts to fuel his research, as he seeks to create technologically advanced robots called Sentinels, with the sole purpose of wiping out all of mutant kind. His Sentinel program, though, was swiftly shut down by US leaders, who didn't believe mutants were a threat worth worrying much about. That wasn't until Mystique, upon discovering Trask had killed many of her own kind, decided to assassinate him during his presentation of the program at the Paris Peace Accords, which subsequently resulted in her being temporarily captured and experimented on at Trask Industries as well, until she eventually managed to escape. Even after her escape, though, the program continued to receive funding off the record, allowing Trask Industries to complete the Sentinels by the mid-2010s, which are now not only capable of targeting and killing mutants, but also have the ability to adapt to any mutant power. Bringing the X-Men back together doesn't do much to prevent their race's inevitable fate though, nor that of humans, as over time, the Sentinels' AI begins to evolve, now no longer only targeting mutants, but also humans with potential to have mutant children, resulting in Earth by 2023 becoming a war-torn wasteland, with both mutants and humans on the brink of extinction. Still, quite a few X-Men have managed to survive all this time, specifically Colossus, Iceman, Storm, Magneto, Professor X, and of course Wolverine. In addition to other mutants we haven't yet spoke about or met, who've labeled themselves the Free Mutants, including James Proudstar, aka Warpath, Clarice Ferguson, aka Blink, Roberto DaCosta, aka Sunspot, Lucas Bishop, and Kitty Pryde, aka Shadowcat, the latter of whom has the most notable ability for their current situation, as she, on top of being able to phase through matter, is capable of projecting one's consciousness into the body of their past self, a power that the X-Men believe could potentially allow one of them to jump all the way back to 1973 to prevent this war from ever beginning. Kitty, though, claims going that far back would tear the person's mind apart, so Logan offers himself up for the mission, since his healing factor would likely prevent that, and the group ultimately agrees, sending him back to find Charles and Eric's younger selves, since they'll both have to work together in order to change Mystique's path. Upon awakening in his 1973 self, Logan makes his way to the X-Mansion and explains the situation to Charles' younger self, as well as a younger Hank McCoy, but Charles, who at this time was relatively fresh off of being abandoned by both Eric and Mystique, doesn't see any way he could possibly set them on a path for redemption. However, he still ultimately agrees to help. So the trio next shift their focus onto Magneto, who at this time was being held in a prison made purely of concrete and sand 100 floors beneath the Pentagon, after being falsely accused of helping assassinate the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. And thanks to help from a younger version of one of Logan's future friends, who we haven't yet met, named Peter Maximoff, aka Quicksilver, a mutant capable of moving at superhuman speeds. They're able to easily break him out without leaving behind any casualties. Peter then returns home while Eric, Charles, Logan, and Hank journey on a flight to Paris, fortunately arriving just in time to prevent Mystique from killing Trask. But while the original plan was for Charles to talk her down, Eric decides to take matters into his own hands, grabbing hold of a gun and firing it at Mystique in order to secure their future. Although fortunately for her, the bullet only manages to pierce her leg as she jumps out the window and makes her escape, while Beast attacks Eric to prevent him from harming her any further. This public display of mutant violence leaves humans even more afraid of mutants than they already were, allowing Trask to easily convince the president to give his Sentinel program the green light, as well as reveal the program to the public during his upcoming announcement outside the White House. Eric and Mystique, though, see this event as the perfect opportunity for them to unleash their respective attacks, with Mystique disguising herself as a Secret Serviceman to see out her mission of killing Trask, and Magneto arriving with the objective of killing him, the president, and any other US officials in attendance. But the latter's plan actually ends up failing thanks to Mystique, who, not believing they all deserve to die, disguises herself as the president to momentarily distract and subsequently shoot him straight through the side of the neck to knock him out, before she then turns the gun back on Trask, although he, along with everyone else, is suddenly frozen in place by Charles, who, with her now positioned to be perceived as the hero, telepathically pleads with her one last time not to do it. And luckily, she ultimately listens, sparing Trask, who's subsequently imprisoned and has his Sentinel program shut down to successfully prevent their grim fates in the future. As seen when Logan's consciousness finally returns to his 2023 body, and he awakens in the X-Mansion, where he's greeted by many of the friends he'd lost over the years, such as Rogue, Hank, Scott, and Jean, before meeting with the professor so he can help him catch up on all that's happened in the last 50 years. Just 5 years after preventing the extinction of mutant kind, though, their race is faced with yet another tragedy, as suddenly one day, Charles, now suffering from Alzheimer's disease, slips into a seizure that causes him to lose control of his telepathic abilities, and inflicts an immense amount of psychic pain onto those within range, paralyzing their minds and bodies and leaving them unable to breathe. And ultimately, this seizure causes injuries to around 600 people, in addition to the deaths of several X-Men. In response to what would later be dubbed the Westchester Incident, Charles Xavier's mind is declared a weapon of mass destruction by the US government. So, to avoid the government imprisoning Charles, or even sentencing him to death, Logan, whose healing factor had helped him survive the seizure, has himself and the professor declared dead as they go into hiding, with the two seen a year later living in an abandoned smelting plant in northern Mexico, along with another mutant named Caliban, capable of locating and tracking mutants with a superhuman sense of smell. Also, over the course of the last year, it's become apparent that for some unidentified reason, mutants have just been dying off, leaving the race on the brink of extinction once again, since there haven't been any new mutants born in the last 25 years either. So Logan, with the X-Men all presumably gone outside of himself and Charles, has been left without a purpose in life, now spending his days working as a chauffeur in order to pay for Charles' medication and keep him alive, despite him no longer wanting to live himself, as after 50 years of living with an adamantium skeleton, the metal has begun poisoning him, weakening his healing factor and in turn causing him to begin aging rapidly, all of which has made him consider just ending it all with the same adamantium bullet Stryker had shot him in the head with that he's held onto through all these years. Somehow though, Logan's life is soon made even more complicated when he's approached by a woman named Gabriela Lopez, who's aware of who he is and desperately needs his help in escaping the men coming to kill her and the young girl she's with named Laura. So in exchange for $20,000, she asks that he drive them across the border to Canada, and Logan, although reluctant, agrees to take them the following morning. When he arrives the next day though, he finds she's already been killed, with the young girl nowhere to be found. So he returns home only to discover that Laura had actually hitched a ride in his trunk, leading to the subsequent arrival of a group of cybernetically enhanced humans called the Reavers, led by Donald Pierce, head of security for scientific corporation Alkali Transigen. And they promptly attack Logan and abduct Caliban as they make their way towards Laura. But she proves to be much stronger than she appears, shockingly pulling out adamantium claws similar to Logan's, and viciously killing many of them en route to escaping with Charles and Logan. Through a video made by Gabriella in the event of her death, the two learn that Laura, also labeled X-23, and many other children were birthed in Transigen's research facility in Mexico City, using DNA samples stolen from older mutants, with the source of Laura's DNA in particular being Logan, making her his biological daughter. The reason Transigen has begun breeding mutants was so that they could turn them into mutant soldiers, but after failing to control the children in the way they'd hoped, they decided to shut the program down in favor of a new one, and so began euthanizing the kids, leading Gabriella, who worked there as a nurse, to try and free as many of them as she could, and lead them to what's believed to be a sanctuary for mutants called Eden. But on the way, she and Laura had got separated from the others, so she now needs Logan to take her there, and Charles urges him to do it, believing it could allow a future for mutants after all. Things begin to appear much less optimistic after the three take a moment to rest that night though, as Transigen managed to uncover their location thanks to a tortured Caliban, and decide to unleash their newest mutant weapon onto them, the X-24, revealed to be an exact clone of Wolverine, which shockingly kills Professor X before attempting to leave with Laura. Although that's quickly interrupted by the real Logan, who engages in a brutal brawl against the clone that he struggles to gain the upper hand in, even nearly being killed. But eventually, the clone gets sent flying into a nearby lawn equipment, allowing Logan and Laura the chance to escape, while Caliban, in an attempt to make up for what he's done, grabs hold of 2 grenades and creates a huge explosion to take out the rest of Transigen's men, sacrificing himself in the process. After burying the one friend he had left in this world, a furious and heartbroken Logan attempts to continue the journey to Eden, but the wounds he'd sustained during the previous battle make it difficult, eventually forcing Laura to take over the wheel and drive them there herself, which she actually manages to do, allowing her to finally reunite with her friends safe and sound. To help with Logan's injuries, the kids, led by a young boy named Richter, give him a dose of a serum containing the mutant growth hormone, which they'd collected from Transigen prior to their escape, and after resting for 2 days, Logan's able to get back on his feet, just as the kids are preparing for a journey across the border that he'll not be joining them on, much to Laura's dismay. He's ultimately forced to help the kids though, upon noticing Transigen vehicle and aircrafts following after them. So he rushes into the woods and injects himself with all the serum they had left, which grants him the strength to unleash a vicious attack and kill several Weavers alongside Laura, before coming face to face with the man behind Transigen, Dr. Xander Rice, who it turns out was also the man who'd wiped out the mutant race, using genetically modified food to spread a virus that prevented natural mutant births and killed any mutant that consumed it. This revelation also immediately prompts Logan to suddenly shoot Dr. Rice through the neck, resulting in Pierce unleashing X-24 onto him once again. Although, as the two Logans battle, Pierce also finds himself completely surrounded by the kids, who use their combined powers to brutally kill him. Meanwhile, after a violent battle, X-24 eventually manages to fatally wound Logan as he shouts for Laura and the kids to run, stabbing him through and dragging him by his shoulder onto a wooden spike. But his attack is then suddenly stopped by Logan's adamantium bullet shot straight through his head by Laura. Still though, the clone's attack is just too much for Logan to come back from at this point. So with his dying breath, he urges Laura not to be the weapon they made her to be, and he appears to feel a sense of relief as he finally passes away. Before we can get into what the Time Variance Authority is, we first have to go back to why they were introduced in the first place. So let's begin in 2012, following what's since been dubbed the Battle of New York, which saw the 6 founding members of the Avengers, Iron Man, Hulk, Black Widow, Thor, Hawkeye, and Captain America, defending Earth from and battling against Loki Laufeyson of Asgard, the adoptive brother of Thor, who after learning his adoptive father, Odin, had lied to him about his true origins, and having grown bitter due to Thor being favored over him all his life, decided, with aid from one of the galaxy's most powerful beings, the Mad Titan Thanos, to try and take over Earth, believing the position of king was his birthright. But ultimately, he and his army of Chitauri soldiers were defeated by the Avengers, resulting in him being sent back to and imprisoned on Asgard. As the years went on, Loki and Thor would have various opportunities to make amends, but for one reason or another, it seemed Loki was always destined to return to his deceitful ways. And just when it appeared Loki may finally come around and fight by his brother's side, he'd be killed shortly thereafter at the hands of Thanos, as the latter began his quest to collect the 6 immensely powerful Infinity Stones, which is why he'd originally sent Loki to Earth years ago, with the objective of using them to bring stability to the universe by wiping out half of all life, as he believed its massive population would inevitably cause it to perish. And despite the efforts of a now even bigger team of Avengers, and even heroes from other planets, Thanos would eventually complete his mission, wielding the 6 stones in his Infinity Gauntlet and snapping his fingers to wipe out half of all life, which included about half of the Avengers, before then using the stones to destroy the stones, making his actions seemingly irreversible. Fortunately though, 5 years later in 2023, the heroes managed to figure out a way to travel back in time, although only to other universes. So they formed a plan to collect the stones from these past timelines so they can then use their combined powers to bring back everyone that was lost. And ultimately, this plan works, although there is a slight hiccup along the way during their trip back to 2012, following the aforementioned Battle of New York, as while Iron Man and Ant-Man's 2023 variants were attempting to steal the Tesseract containing the Space Stone, which Loki's 2012 variant had been trying to collect as part of the deal he'd made with Thanos. They end up quickly losing possession of it while sneaking away by the sudden arrival of the Hulk, who comes bursting through the wall and knocks the case holding the Tesseract right to the captured Loki's feet, who then grabs hold of the cube and uses it to escape imprisonment through a portal that ends up transporting him to the Gobi Desert in Mongolia, where we're finally introduced to the agents of the Time Variance Authority, led by Hunter B-15, who enter through a portal of their own and arrest him for his crimes against the sacred timeline. Upon being brought back to their headquarters along with the Tesseract, which is powerless here, as is he, Loki, while awaiting his trial, is shown a video starring an artificial intelligence named Miss Minutes, which explains that long ago, there was a vast multiversal war that nearly resulted in the total destruction of everything, until the all-knowing timekeepers emerged and reorganized the multiverse into one sacred timeline. But sometimes variants veer off the path the timekeepers created for them, creating a nexus event, which causes a new branch on the timeline to form that, left unchecked, could potentially lead to another multiversal war. So to prevent that, the timekeepers created the TVA and its workers to set time back on its predetermined path, which leaves the variants that veered off said path without a place on the timeline, and so they must stand trial for their offenses. For his trial, Loki's taken before Judge Ravonna Renslayer, who promptly sentences him to be pruned. Although, before they can follow through with this, Renslayer is approached by another TVA agent, Mobius M. Mobius, who we learn has been searching for a dangerous variant who's been attacking and killing hunters as they attend to Nexus events and stealing their reset charges, and who he believes Loki may be able to help them find, since this dangerous variant happens to be another variant of Loki. Initially, Loki's skeptical that anything about this place was to be taken seriously, but after Mobius literally presents him with events from his past and predetermined future, he's convinced the TVA may just be the greatest power in the universe, and so agrees to help with the intention of eventually taking over the TVA himself. With Loki's help, they're soon able to pinpoint the variant's possible location in a 2050 apocalypse after realizing that, within apocalypses, their presence wouldn't form a branch in the sacred timeline, since the location will be destroyed anyway. And shortly after their arrival, Loki's confronted by the variant, revealed to be a female Loki who chooses to go by Sylvie. Sylvie's war against the TVA actually started back when she was just a child, as one day she was suddenly abducted by a unit of hunters led by Renslayer and taken back to their headquarters to be pruned, a fate she just managed to avoid after escaping their custody with Renslayer's Tempad, the device used to open time doors, through which she escaped, and while spending the next several years growing up at the ends of 1,000 worlds to remain hidden, she began plotting her revenge. And now, after all this time, she looks to finally exact it, sending the reset charges she'd previously stolen through various time doors to essentially bomb the sacred timeline, before exiting through a time door back to the TVA in search of the Timekeepers. Her hunt for the Timekeepers is soon interrupted though by Loki, who proposes that the two instead work together to take over the TVA, which Sylvie wants no part in, before they're then surrounded by a unit of hunters and Renslayer, forcing them to retreat through another time door, which inadvertently brings them to an apocalyptic event on the moon Lamentis 1 in the year 2077, which it appears they'll not be able to escape due to her Tempad having been crushed. So the two spend their final day discussing and bonding over some of the negative and positive parts of their lives growing up as a Loki, while Sylvie also reveals one of the TVA's dark secrets she's uncovered over that time, explaining that the Timekeepers have actually been lying to their workers about where they really come from, as they'd all been plucked from their respective lives on the sacred timeline. Unfortunately, there isn't much Loki can do with this information now, as their demise continues to grow nearer. So the two accept their fate, locking eyes and hands, until suddenly, two time doors from the TVA appear beside them, as for some reason, their actions have created a branch on the timeline. So they're both taken back to and separately imprisoned at their headquarters, with Loki being questioned by Mobius about the branch he and Sylvie had created, that Mobius soon realizes came as the result of two variants of the same being sharing romantic feelings for one another. Although Loki chooses against acknowledging his feelings for now, and instead takes this opportunity to try and reveal the truth behind the TVA and how they're all variants to him, which Mobius refuses to believe at first, but after some investigating, he discovers that Loki is actually telling the truth, so he decides to put his trust in him and prepares to break him and Sylvie out of the TVA's custody. Although this is immediately interrupted by Renslayer, revealed to have been aware of the truth for quite some time and helping keep it hidden, and who then suddenly prunes Mobius before bringing Loki and Sylvie before the Timekeepers, who've requested to be in attendance for their pruning. Luckily for the variants though, they're saved at the last moment by the aforementioned Hunter B-15, who'd also become aware of the truth following Sylvie's attack on the TVA earlier, during which Sylvie had used her powers of enchantment against B-15, which unlocks some of her previously erased memories. So she now helps them take out Ravonna and her unit of hunters, leaving no one left to guard the Timekeepers, and allowing Sylvie to immediately decapitate one of them, before the other two strangely appear to shut down, revealing that the Timekeepers aren't actually living beings, but just mindless androids. Before they can figure out what to do next, she and Loki are suddenly pruned by a recovered Renslayer while B-15 is imprisoned. Being pruned doesn't result in one's death though, as it instead transports them to the void guarded by the trans-temporal entity Alioth, which Loki, Sylvie, and Mobius managed to initially avoid before Sylvie, although in possession of a working tempad, proposes the idea of her enchanting the beast, believing it must be guarding whoever's behind all of this. So Loki agrees to help her, while Mobius is sent back with the tempad to the TVA to inform them all of the truth, which he does with help from B-15, revealing to the other hunters the past life of their leader Renslayer. Mobius then also confronts Renslayer herself, still believing they can work together to rebuild the TVA while also protecting people's free will. But she's more concerned with aligning herself with the person behind it all, and so exits through a time door in search of them. Loki and Sylvie, meanwhile, are ultimately able to use their combined powers to enchant Alioth and reveal behind it a citadel at the end of time, where they're finally introduced by Miss Minutes to the man behind it all, He Who Remains, a variant of scientist Nathaniel Richards, who explains that eons ago, a variant of himself lived on Earth in the 31st century and became the first to come in contact with alternate universes and his own variants. But although there was peace at first, eventually some of his variants looked to conquer other universes, resulting in a multiversal war. And from all the tears in reality came Alioth, which he managed to weaponize to put an end to the war, before then creating the TVA as well as the Sacred Timeline to prevent any branches in reality that will result in his variants rising again. It turns out though that for a long time, he's been looking for someone to take his place, having grown tired and older. So he proposes that they take over, as he believes out of every scenario he's seen play out, that they're the best choice. Sylvie doesn't buy it though, and goes to kill him, before being stopped by Loki, who does believe him and thinks they should consider taking his place if it means staving off something worse, which results in a short battle between the two, as she believes he's just seeking another throne. But Loki insists that all he truly cares about is making sure she's okay, leading them to share a kiss before Sylvie then suddenly shoves him back through a time door and ultimately stabs He Who Remains through the heart, who claims he'll be seeing her soon as new branches begin to form in the timeline behind him. Meanwhile, we see Sylvie's time door had sent Loki back to the TVA, although not in the present day, as he strangely somehow ended up in the past to a time when He Who Remains was known across the TVA as the ruler. Soon though, he's suddenly and horrifically pulled through time back to the present, where he immediately finds Mobius and explains to him everything that had happened, before the two then begin noticing power surges throughout the TVA, leading them to head down to repairs and advancements, headed by Ouroboros, nicknamed OB, who's also the author of the TVA guidebook. And he discovers that this is due to the TVA's temporal loom, where raw time is refined into a physical timeline, overloading as a result of the new branches forming on the sacred timeline that they now refuse to prune. So Obi decides to close the blast doors for now to protect the TVA, while he figures out a way to retrofit the loom so it can handle the new branches. But what Obi didn't realize was that after closing the blast doors, he wouldn't be able to open them again without either Miss Minutes, who's gone completely AWOL, to override the lock, or a live scan of the temporal aura of the person who designed them, He Who Remains. Fortunately though, they're soon able to gain a possible lead to finding Miss Minutes by tracing the tempad Renslayer had escaped with, which had given them 2 possible destinations, the first being 1868 Chicago, Illinois, where we actually revisit Renslayer as she meets with Miss Minutes, who, as apparently ordered to by He Who Remains, has Renslayer leave a package at a young boy's window, before they then travel to their second destination, the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, which after not finding any sight of Renslayer or Miss Minutes at the previous destination, Loki and Mobius subsequently travel to as well. Their search for either of the two is momentarily halted though, when they come across a display of an invention labeled the Astounding Temporal Marvels, created by Victor Timely, who's revealed to be a variant of He Who Remains, and the young boy Renslayer and Miss Minutes had delivered the package to, which is revealed to have been the TVA guidebook. Following his demonstration, both pairs attempt to track Victor down, but it actually ends up being Sylvie who manages to intercept him, and who, since having killed He Who Remains, decided to travel to one of the Sacred Timeline's new branches to finally experience life. However, she soon learned of this Victor Timely, and so has now arrived to ensure he never reaches the peak of his powers. Loki, though, believes he's their only hope of fixing the loom and saving everything, so he's forced to battle against her once again to prevent her from killing him, which gives Renslayer and Miss Minutes the opening to retrieve Timely for themselves, who Ravonna then threatens with a prototype time wand, forcing him to follow her command. That is until Loki and Sylvie, after having come to an understanding, eventually track them down once again and wrestle them back to the TVA, as Ravonna and Miss Minutes continue their pursuit, which is ultimately brought to a definitive end after they manage to take Miss Minutes offline by rebooting the system before pruning Renslayer and sending her to the Void, where she defiantly comes face to face with Alioth. Now the group shifts their focus back to the temporal loom, for which Ouroboros has created a throughput multiplier that should allow them to scale the loom's capacity so it can manage the backlog of branches. So they use Timely's temporal aura to open the blast doors, revealing the worsening temporal radiation, which one of them must rush their way through in order to place the multiplier in position, and Victor decides he should be the one to do it, feeling somewhat responsible for all of this. And so he suits up and prepares to head down the gangway. Shockingly though, the moment he steps out of the blast doors, his body disintegrates into nothing and he's killed instantly, leaving everyone stunned and horrified as the loom continues to overload before ultimately exploding, destroying them and the TVA. However, Loki has managed to survive the blast due to him once again slipping through time, now to a branch timeline in 1994 Pasadena, California, where he encounters a variant of OB named A.D. Doug PhD, who in this universe is a theoretical physics professor at Caltech and struggling science fiction author. Loki attempts to explain his current situation to AD, and somewhat surprisingly, AD actually believes him, and proposes that maybe if he's able to bring everyone he was with when the loom was destroyed back together in one place, they could use their collective temporal auras as coordinates to direct Loki back to that exact moment in time. Since Loki's still unable to control his time slipping though, AD is forced to build one of the TVA's tempads based on the information within Loki's TVA guidebook to gather everyone up, which after a long while, he manages to complete, allowing him and Loki to find and convince variants of Mobius, B-15, and Casey to join them. Although convincing Sylvie proves to be more difficult, as it turns out she'd also survived the destruction of the loom and promptly returned to her timeline, believing that, with the loom and the TVA destroyed, all of their workers can go back to their real lives. But ultimately she has no choice but to join them, as soon her branched universe begins to disintegrate into nothing, just as Timely did previously. Before, even more frighteningly, just as they go to read their collective temporal auras, each variant in this entire universe begins to disintegrate as well, leaving nothing left but Loki, who fortunately manages to avoid vanishing into nothing by gaining control of his time slipping and bringing himself back to just moments before the loom's destruction. After witnessing Timely immediately disintegrate once again, Loki repeatedly slips back in time in an attempt to get him out there sooner and faster. And eventually, after centuries of research and experimenting, Loki is able to get Timely down the gangway without harm, allowing him to put the throughput multiplier in position, which fortunately works in expanding the loom's capacity. However, this still proves to not be enough, as the loom quickly begins overloading once again. After witnessing Timely immediately disintegrate once again, Loki repeatedly slips back in time in an attempt to get him out there sooner and faster. And eventually, after centuries of research and experimenting, Loki is able to get Timely down the gangway without harm, allowing him to put the throughput multiplier in position, which fortunately works in expanding the loom's capacity. However, this still proves to not be enough, as the loom quickly begins overloading once again, unable to integrate the branches forming at an infinite rate. So Loki decides to slip back again all the way to before Sylvie killed He Who Remains to try and stop the timelines from branching in the first place. But after countless attempts, he's still unable to stop her from killing him, which eventually leads He Who Remains to suddenly put their battle on pause himself by freezing Sylvie in time. It's revealed that everything Loki's gone through since he and Sylvie had first arrived at the Citadel was actually put in motion by He Who Remains, as we learn that he'd rigged his temp pad moments prior to Sylvie using it against Loki, so that he'd be sent back to the TVA's past, which then led Loki's body in an attempt to adjust to this displacement in time to begin time slipping. And it turns out the reason he'd aided him in gaining this ability and paved the road for his entire journey was so that they could finally speak alone without Sylvie, since she's proven unwilling to negotiate. He Who Remains hopes that now, after all he's learned, Loki will finally heed his warning and take his place at the end of time to protect the sacred timeline. But still, Loki refuses to join him, believing there's another way, which involves him slipping back to just before the loom's destruction once again, and after saying goodbye to his friends, heading down the gangway and destroying the loom himself, which causes all the branch timelines to scatter and begin dying, before he then grabs hold of each and every one of these dead branches and uses his power to give them life, so that he can then carry them with him all the way up to what's left of He Who Remains Citadel, where he's prepared to spend the rest of eternity in order to protect people's free will and allow the multiverse to continue growing. And that was everything you needed to know before Deadpool and Wolverine. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.